Hello and welcome back to a completely different setting today. Today I'm in my art studio backing onto the garden, so if you hear garden sounds or neighbours, that's what's going on in the background. But it's been hot here today in England. It was too hot to film anywhere else apart from by the garden door. So today I want to bring you a video with a 6-month catch-up and a touch base for my DIY literature degree, which I started in January. In this one I wanted to focus on some of the things I've discovered over the last 6 months about what happens when you're trying to plan a journey of self-study, when you're trying to put down the stepping stones yourself, when you're trying to study literature and you've got no course outline, you've got no tutors around you, you've got no university syllabus that's laid out your reading list for you, when you're trying to do it all yourself. That leads me to the first point that I've discovered: this process is messy, and that's okay. Do expect it to be messy. Literature is vast. The world of literature in all its forms, it's vast, it's immense, it's enormous. You're not immediately going to fall into straight passive study that makes sense, so be prepared for a bit of messiness. And also, I think the second point is to be flexible. I've realised how flexible I need to be. I think the flexibility comes in mostly around goal setting. When you first start to plan a DIY literature degree, you ask yourself, well, what do I want to learn? What's my goal here? My very first video, which I'll link below, is how to plan a DIY literature degree. I shared my initial planning, and from that naturally formed those initial goals. So to recap quickly, my initial planning kind of looked like this. Basically, I went on university websites, I opened up university reading lists where I could find them, I opened up university lists of modules that you would be studying. I also went onto YouTube and found various YouTubers that had shared their university literature degree journeys, and I wrote down their reading lists and their modules, and through doing that I found some resources and some ideas of what a DIY literature degree is. In that process, I realised that basically there are 3 types of module that people study. You either study literature by time era, so say you might do a term or module on Victorian literature, or you might do a module on modern literature or romantic literature, or Old English. So you can come at your literature studies from a time era, or you could come at it from a genre, so Gothic and horror, science fiction literature, romance in literature. So some modules are planned around genre like that, or some modules had more fancy titles and they were more thematic. I know that Emma over at Emmy, she shared a fantastic module that she did on deformed space and time. So that module was full of books across all time eras that had that topic of somehow space deforming or time, like time travel, that sort of thing. And I thought that was a fascinating way of coming at modules as well. Also, in all of the research that I did in that video, there was also always 2 modules on literary theory and criticism, so that had to come into it somewhere. So with that initial study, naturally out of that I've discovered came some goals, that question of what would I like to do. And a lot of the university syllabuses had Victorian literature down as the first year of key study. A lot of universities do Victorian literature in year 1, and I also had recently, when I started at the start of the year, been to a charity shop and I'd found these 3 books for £2, all Charles Dickens. So I found the Pickwick Papers, which I still haven't read. I found David Copperfield, which I read in the first quarter of the year. I also found A Tale of Two Cities. I then also found Bleak House, which I've also read this year. So it was sheer luck that I came across a whole load of Charles Dickens books. I'd just done all the research on syllabuses, realised Victorian literature was often a big part of year one, so it was a natural progression for me. Start planning around Victorian literature as one of the modules I wanted to study. Then I think you have to start asking questions. I think asking questions of yourself helps you come up with some goals. So I asked myself, what do I want to do in my Victorian studies? I got a bullet journal, all for just simple list making and note taking about the overview of my course. Victorian studies, my initial goals for Victorian studies that I wrote down right at the start of the year was to get an overview of Victorian literature and to read key authors. I wanted to read at least 5 brand new authors to me, to understand the social problems and life in Victorian times via the literature, to read novels, poetries and plays, so a overview of different forms of literature, and also to have some key authors for Victorian literature, to read all of Charles Dickens and all of the Bronte sisters novels. So those were some of my very broad, big, general priorities and goals that I asked myself. What do I want to do? I want to have read all of Charles Dickens. I want to have read all of the Bronte sisters. I want a broad overview of what Victorian literature reads like and what it is, and to come across some brand new authors to me. Those goals were very, very broad at the start, but I think it's another key point. It doesn't matter if they're broad to start with. I think having some initial goals set when you're forming a path to step onto for self-study is really important. And I would say keep those goals general and bigger at the start. Let that path that you're about to step on be quite broad at the start. I think that's important because you've got to realise that you haven't read the books yet. You don't know what in these books you are going to find the most fascinating and interesting. If you read Bleak House, is it going to be Victorian law that you find most interesting? Or is it that idea of the slums of London and poverty and the social classes that's going to be the most interesting? Is it the female characters and losing reputation and what that does for women in Victorian literature going to be the most interesting? When you're doing self-study, you have to read the book first to know what you find most interesting. It's very different to being on a university degree where you've got a tutor who set the books and they know exactly what they want to highlight from that book. They've already read the books, they know where they're going, but you don't. So that's why I say keep those goals really broad at the beginning and let them evolve as you read. You're on this to enjoy reading anyway. It doesn't matter if even you read like 10 or 20 books that you can't really find what you want to pull out of them. It doesn't matter, you're still getting that general overview. So I would say to have a goal like to get a general overview of Victorian literature, or to get a general overview of early modern, or to get a general overview of the Regency period of literature is a great first goal to have. And then as you read, let that path begin to focus down. You might get different paths with different focuses begin to shoot off, and that's what I had. And I began to imagine it as a path, as a landscape in my head, walking along, and oh look, there's another path that I could follow down there, but I'm really interested in that path too over there. And I just let that path begin to form naturally as I read. So this is also something that Kate spoke about over at Kate's Corner. I love Kate's channel. And you excuse the neighbours' children, summer sounds, it's beautiful out there. But Kate over at Kate's Corner, she's one of the channels that I use to talk about her literature degree. She shared a lot of her literature degree over at Oxford, but recently she did a Q&A video and she asked for questions, and I submitted the question: if you were doing a DIY literature degree yourself for self-study, how would you go about planning it? And she replied, which I was really thrilled about, and I'll put her response in here.
Your best advice, actually just one more question, so this is a great one to end. Your best advice to someone doing a DIY literature degree, plus a huge thank you for your content. I love that. Oh my goodness. Also, how cool to do a DIY literature degree. I think that's so fascinating. Okay, top tips for doing this. Study what you're interested in. There is a range of literature out there on any subject that you could want to focus on. You want to focus on Russian literature? Focus on Russian literature. You want to focus on world literature? Focus on world literature. You want to focus on nuanced feminist literature in the early modern period? Fantastic. You've got about, I think, up to 10 authors to focus on. You want to focus on a new historicist approach to literary theory? Do it. Welcome, engage, enjoy, have fun with it. I think the great thing about doing a DIY literature degree, which I just love the idea for, by the way, I'm actually thinking there might be a future video, but I just think that something like that offers you the flexibility to do and to study whatever you want to do. Just plan it out, structure it properly, and I'll take it back to the first question. Set aside time every single week to do something in it. Plan it out, block it off, put it in your calendars, and do that, because that is just phenomenal, and I think we should always be continuing learning.
So Kate really did emphasise that idea of just do what you love, just really go for what you love. So I think once you've made those broad goals and you kind of know sort of the time period or the genre that you're reading, then let those themes then grow out of that love, like things that are sparking your interest in books. What are you loving? What would you absolutely love to study more of? It was just a real shove to then come up with thematic ideas and modules. So I think when you start your self-study, it's much easier to either go for like a genre, say Gothic fiction, or to go for a time period, say the Victorian fiction. Start off with that and then let any thematic modules then develop out of your reading. It's much easier, I think, than trying to come up with a theme to study when you don't know the books. So that's what I did. I went to my trusty notebook and I made a page with some imaginary ideas for modules. So here I'm pretending that I am a professor. I'm in charge of inventing the modules. So I am just coming up with titles as things crop up in my reading that I think, oh, that would be lovely to find out more about. So I'm going to go through these titles that I came up with. So module titles, once you start reading for thematic studies. Try this, get a page in a notebook, keep it just for this. So my first title on here is Stack the Chairs or Serve the Tea, Demoting the Goddess in Literature. So I began to get really obsessed with the way female characters are treated in Victorian literature, especially in religious settings. I am an ex-Christian who then has stepped onto a more pagan path. So for me, that is an area of interest anyway, that the way that I'm treated as a Christian woman or the way that I'm treated as a witchy woman, like stepping out of the norm in religion. When I was in church, I was only ever given the jobs of serving the tea or stacking the chairs, and all the men had important jobs in the Christian church. So that's where that title comes from, and that idea of the goddess being squashed or women being squashed within like morality and moral rules or religion. So that's something I'd love to study. For that, over the noise of the neighbours, I would bring in other books like to do with goddess worship and how the goddess and religion kind of one overtook the other and one squashed the other and one pushed the other out. But also I'd link that back to women in literature. So that's an area, that's a definitely very strong path that I'd love to explore. The next title I put is Escaping Marriage, Wives in Literature. It's very self-explanatory. The next title is Ignite the Witch, the bad woman archetype in literature. So anything that's considered bad or rebellious or to be suspicious of. There's a lot of that going on in Victorian literature, and I just loved linking that again with pagan studies. Navigating trauma in literature, that's coming up as well in my Victorian reading. Finding women's voices, retellings from myths to fairy tales, strange women from villain to eccentric, the female voice in Gothic literature. Those are just some examples of some titles that are basically on the map that I'm building. They're new paths coming off from this general study. Now those new paths, each of those new paths, you might then want to do your own research about. We're beginning to focus in now. So you go through the same research process. You try and find books or syllabuses that have got courses like that and see what their reading lists are. YouTube for me has been fabulous for honing down that focus and getting slightly more tailored resources. That's what you see here in these book lists. Now I have to say, for my Victorian book lists, it's been Katie over at Books and Things that has been absolutely fantastic. Such a fantastic channel for resources if you are planning Victorian studies. These book lists are basically from her videos. So she did a video about Victorian feminist novels. I wrote a list of all of those novels. So on here I've got things like The Odd Woman by George Gissing, Jill by Amy Dilwyn, The Half Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury, Hester by Margaret Oliphant, and more and more. And I've got all of those books upstairs now ready to read. I also wrote down novels like fallen women novels, so things like Tessa the D'Urbervilles, Esther Waters, Eastlyn, 5 novels about marriage. Katie's got a fantastic series where she does 5 novels about, so 5 novels about marriage, 5 novels about bad marriages, and then with that idea of wanting to study the Gothic, 5 Victorian novels about ghosts, 5 Victorian novels about spooky houses. So a fantastic resource for those different paths. And from that I've put a more focused reading plan moving forward for the next year and a bit based on those more focused paths. So my goals now have become much more focused down through the actual activity of reading and trying to find what I love. So that looks a bit messy. It looks like I'm going off on tangents and I'm not doing what I set out to do, but it is that messy process of finding what you love and then fine-tuning it again and being prepared to fine-tune it again and being prepared to fine-tune that again. So be prepared to set broad goals and then define them as you go. So with the development of those new paths, it's kind of opened up the time era a little bit, although I still really want a strong focus on Victorian reading for this year. I am looking at exploring out of that time frame around that thematic approach of like the fallen woman or the eccentric woman or the mad woman or the witchy woman. It has led me to start searching for key books that I think might be interesting to read alongside Victorian literature. So I found a few actually last week when I went to Stratford upon Avon filming my Hamlet video. So they've got some fantastic secondhand bookshops in Stratford. I found My Antony by Willa Cather. I think that one sounds like it might fit the bill of like a woman that's othered. Of course, Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. I found Kate Chopin, The Awakening. I found Daniel Defoe's Roxana. I found Samuel Richardson's Pamela. So you can see these are not within that Victorian time frame, but they're on that similar theme. In the same second-hand bookshop in Stratford, I also found this one, Women's Voices, Their Lives and Loves Through 2,000 Years of Letters. So you can see it's more within that theme now. I ordered Women and Marriage in Victorian fiction. I've got Gender, Technology and the New Woman in the Victorian Age, and this book about Victorian feminists. So you can see there's a focus down in my resources as well, which is really, really exciting. I still want that broad overview of Victorian literature reading. I still want to read all of the different novels, but there is a focus path as well, which expands beyond the Victorian reading now, and I'm really excited about that. And I bought some goddess books as well, and then books like this, Victorian books about witches. This is Alan Raines, A Welsh Witch, which I'm really excited to read. Another witchy book by a Victorian author, Elizabeth Gaskell, Lois the Witch, which I've just read and did a video tracking down Elizabeth Gaskell's own footsteps in the village of Burford. This was great to read as well. And the reading that led to that focusing of goals. So last November, a reread of Jane Eyre, like what happens to women in life, and like the things that can happen and how women need to be resourceful. Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South as well, that resourcefulness in women and the standard of morals that women are held to. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, what happens if you marry really badly? What happens if addiction is in the mix? What happens to a woman that has to step away from what would be deemed morally acceptable? And I've just read Agnes Grey as well. You've got similar themes in this to her Tenant of Wildfell Hall. You've got that idea of how women and men are educated differently, the different expectations, women in work, lots and lots of feminists in there. Dracula by Bram Stoker. In this novel, I've really loved the way that the extraordinary circumstances forced women to step into adventures way outside of what it was expected of them as Victorian women. And The Woman in White and The Moonstone, my Wilkie Collins reading in February, ideas of beauty standards and disability with women, and again themes of what happens in engagements and marriages when things start to go wrong. Really fantastic, interesting themes, which did really put me onto that idea of women in Victorian society and like the extraordinary woman. But I'm finding that honing down my interests and what I'm loving to read is also helping in the more difficult topics like literary criticism and theory, which I've found really difficult. I think it's okay to struggle on learning something like this when you haven't got any support. I think it's totally fine. I'm going to embrace the reread and slow learning. So this was a general overview, but as my other goals become slightly more focused, I find that even in topics like this, I have started to collect resources that look at literary criticism and theory, but from a feminine or female viewpoint. So I bought books like The Mad Woman in the Attic, and again from books like this, from the books that they talk about in books like this, you will get more books to read on the topic. I know that this book talks a lot about Shirley, which I'm yet to read. I bought this book on Feminisms, an anthology of literary theory and criticism. This is based on feminist criticism and theory. So just things like that are going to really help with my study, rather than it being this big, overwhelming, huge topic. I've got now like a slice of something to hold on to. It's much easier to hold a slice of cake than the whole cake, even though the whole cake always looks good. In that second-hand bookshop in Stratford as well, I also found this reading women essays in feminist criticism. I picked up this because I know where I'm going now. I'm building the path in front of me. There is a essay in here that I cannot wait to read. It's an essay about my favourite book of the year since I've started this, that of Charlotte Bronte's Villette. The essay is called The Buried Letter in Villette. I cannot wait to read that essay. So it just feels a little bit more concrete now. It doesn't feel quite so messy. Some of that mud that I've been flinging at the wall hoping it would stick has begun to stick. I kind of know where I'm going now. I also realised in the last 6 months that I set myself far too much to do for year one. I said, right, I want to learn Victorian literature at an overview, so Victorian literature reading. I want to learn about Gothic literature, so I set a whole module on a genre. But I also said I wanted to learn about literary criticism and theory. That was another module that would be. But I also said I wanted to read all of Charles Dickens, all of the Bronte books. That's a specialist author. But I added to that a special topic of fairy tales as well. That is more like 2 years worth of study than 1 year, so I've had to cut back a bit. So just be careful and guard against overwhelm if you are doing this. If you are like me and your eyes bigger than your belly kind of thinking, and you jump into everything with both feet, just beware that it can get a little bit overwhelming. I discovered it very, very quickly that some of these topics are so vast you need to reduce them down a bit. Right in January, I started January with a retellings and fairy tale January, and I thought I'm going to learn all about fairy tales. Well, fairy tales and retellings is a subject that's big enough for like a 10-year study, not a 1-month study. So not only did I want to learn about interpretations of fairy tales, I wanted to learn about the history of fairy tales. Very quickly I realised that that wasn't possible in the time frame. So I've reduced it down to this year now, and you might need to do this. You might need to make your goals smaller as well as more focused. So my smaller goal now is to learn about Little Red Riding Hood. I've picked one fairy tale. I've already read a number of retellings. I've already read books about the history of Little Red Riding Hood. I do want to learn a little bit more about interpretations of the fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood. If I can get Little Red Riding Hood studied by the end of this year, I will be happy with that. Same happened with my desire to learn about Gothic literature. I have reduced that very broad and general goal now to something a lot smaller. I just want to learn about the early days of Gothic writing. I read The Italian by Anne Radcliffe in January and loved it, and I've now decided I just want to explore Anne Radcliffe's works this year. One of the very first early Gothic writers. If I can get a feel for Anne Radcliffe's writing by the end of this year as part of my Gothic study, then that will be fabulous. So it might be that you reduce your goals massively once you start reading and find out how vast these topics are, but that's fine too. Finally, I'd like to talk about the fact that you're on your own doing this. You don't have fellow students to chat to, you don't have lectures to discuss things in, you don't have tutors to go to. So it's very nice to find a way to share this, and I think online is fantastic. You could start an in real life book club, you could start an online book club. I know Storygraph is really easy for that. You could start a booktube channel like I did. You could join in some challenges with fellow booktubers. I am 2/3 of the way through my very first Thomas Hardy read at the moment. I'm reading Desperate Remedies as part of Jen the Librarian's Thomas Hardy read along, where we're reading all the novels of Thomas Hardy in publication order. order. A fantastic challenge to join in with when I'm studying Victorian literature. So find ways like that where you can share and discuss your reading. Make a booktube channel if you don't already, or join a book club. So now 6 months in, I feel like I've got some end points. The path is being formed, but I'm beginning to see where it's heading, like the final destination. And I think also thinking about that final destination and how would you like to apply this knowledge that you're getting, finding ways to apply the knowledge. So when I've learned all about Victorian literature, the general overview goal, what would I like to achieve at the end of that? How am I going to apply it? Well, I'd like to make some videos about my general reading. I'd like to bring videos about book recommendations. I'd like to be able to talk to other Victorian literature readers about the books and to know what I'm talking about. That's my goal, end point, and some of that application. With my feminist reading, it would be lovely to really feel like I had an understanding of the books that present that topic and the context of that topic with Victorian history. That's my end point. The application of that is I might do some individual book reviews on that topic. I'm writing essays. I'm trialing different forms of note-taking at the moment. Note-taking is a whole other video that I could make. So essay writing, note taking, it's all there in the application. Video making, like I could set challenges or new projects. I want to do some journals, some artwork to take the reading into other creative aspects, some videos, so some paintings about the books I'm reading. I'd love to do that. So I think it's also important not only to find people to share your study with, but also a way of applying your knowledge. Otherwise you'll lose it. It's easy to forget the books that we read unless you find a way to apply it. So other creative activities, video making, artwork, writing. I think writing's really important when you're doing this, and I will be bringing videos about my trials in writing as well as I go on. So guys, that's it for now. That's what I've found out so far in the first 6 months of the process of planning your journey into self-learning and a DIY literature degree. I hope that's been useful. I'll link all the people I've spoken about in the description box. And thank you for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.